All right, class, welcome from the cave. Back in my fancy library, can you tell? I figured I'd be in a fancy library because we're going to be talking about some fancy people. You can see John Rockefeller here on the screen. The title of this lecture is Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? I mean, everybody does, right? So we are going to spend some time looking at big business and labor unions in this lecture. How they work together, how they don't work together, just basically how they interact. You can see this interesting fact here that Rockefeller was the only person who was affected by the 79% tax bracket. If you can imagine such a thing. I don't think we have anything near that now. But this was during the Great Depression, and they were trying to solve all kinds of problems. So anyway, we'll talk about Rockefeller and some of these other guys later. But first, let's talk about them as a group. Sometimes these guys are called captains of industry. And you see on the screen Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and the guy with the big nose is J.P. Morgan. All of these guys are super rich, and they're all the sort of the beginners of the industry, and they did things that no one else could do. It's one of the themes for this lecture is that there are no rules. And so these guys have a lot of ground to move around in before they do anything illegal. So the government just wasn't involved in this kind of business yet, but we'll see that that will change. So some people call these guys captains of industries. Captains of industry. Why? Because they created jobs, they did increase production, they did things that no one else has ever done. They produced cheap, good products, and they gave a lot of money back to the community. Rockefeller in particular gave so much money back to the community, it's not even funny, and a lot of that money still exists. Rockefeller, of course, is maybe the richest person in history. But they're also referred to as robber barons because they did exploit workers. They did influence the government. The slide says corrupted the government. I stole this slide from someone else. That sort of depends on how you look at it. Some of these guys were good men, some of them were not, just like any other group of people. They were greedy. Again, that's relative and it depends on the person, but sometimes they're looked at one way or the other. Really, they should probably be looked at as a little of both. So you have to take each one individually for the kinds of things that they did. So first of all, let's think about some business types of big business. Some of these are words I'll use, especially monopoly quite a bit. But a monopoly, not the board game, although the board game works on this similar principle. Monopoly is a company that controls most or all of a business in a particular industry. Now in this case, where I'm going to say monopolies were good early on and then they became bad. We don't generally like monopolies. Monopolies can cause a number of problems. I'll talk about that later. But in this arena where they're creating entirely new industries, they have so much control that they're able to create an industry that works and works well before anything happens with monopolies or monopolies get broken down. Today, this would be almost impossible to do. Even the richest people today and the companies that control the most, think of really big ones like Walmart or Amazon, they are not monopolies. They are far from it. They might feel like it, but they're not. So then you have a corporation, which is a very common business model where many investors buy stocks and they kind of own the company. So if you buy stocks, you are an investor in a corporation. You actually do own probably a really small piece of that company. That's very common. That's how a company raises money so that they can develop new products and grow. And then there's the trust, which is a group of corporations that have been put together and they're run by a single board of directors. And Rockefeller's going to make one of the first trusts. And a trust isn't by itself a monopoly, but it acts like a monopoly. And the differences aren't that important for this class, but they act the same way in terms of how they control the economy and how they get too big and how they cause some problems. So we'll come back and talk about competition and monopoly later in this lecture. So here's John Rockefeller. He's an old man in this picture. He lived to be 97, you can see. But he's the one who creates Standard Oil. If I can, I'm going to put a video up from the series called The Men Who Built America, if I can get one that I can upload for you. And I want you to watch this, the one about Rockefeller and how he does business. It's not going to be on the test per se, but it's good to watch. So I'm trying to work on that. But anyway, he creates a company called Standard Oil. He invests all of his money and gets a couple partners, and they create this company. They buy a refinery, and their main focus is to create kerosene. And the reason he wants to create kerosene is because kerosene's in high demand, because previously what people used to burn in their lamps was something like whale oil, and whale oil is getting really hard to come by. Remember, previous lecture we talked about buffalo and how buffalo were getting hunted out during this period of time in the late 1800s. The same thing's happening to the whales. And so whale oil is getting really difficult, therefore really expensive. And so right about the time of the Civil War, people started discovering different uses for crude oil, that black junk that comes out of the ground. But now one of the refined products is kerosene. So he builds an entire company, an entire reputation, and most of his fortune on Standard Oil making kerosene. And he calls it Standard Oil because he wanted to create good kerosene. There were a lot of people making kerosene, but a lot of it was unstable. There was such a rush to get it to market, and it was dangerous. I mean, it's dangerous enough as a normal fuel. It's similar to gasoline. And, you know, we don't wave that stuff around, and although we put it in our cars, it's very controlled. It's very dangerous outside of those contained spaces. But they're also going to go on and create various lubricants and various coolants and things like that out of oil. So not just kerosene. And ultimately, they'll make gasoline. And, of course, Standard Oil will become one of the biggest gasoline companies in the world. And then later on, that gets broken up into companies like Chevron and Exxon and Mobil and others that you've heard of. Those used to be part of Standard Oil, but in the early 1900s, the government came and cracked down on them and broke up the monopoly. So you can see here that he controlled over 90% of the world's oil refining capacity, which is unreal. That's probably the biggest monopoly ever. And basically what that means is almost all the oil being produced in the world was being produced in the United States, and he controlled almost all of that. So this creates a monopoly. And again, later we'll talk about some of the problems that it created. So he died at 97 years old in 1937. He was the first billionaire in his era dollars in 1936, 37. He was worth something like $1.4 billion. That sounds like a lot, and it is. But if you run that through the machine of time, and how much would that money be worth now? It's something like $600 billion. And just to give you a little perspective, Jeff Bezos, the guy that owns Amazon, his fortune peaked at about $100 billion. Bill Gates' fortune peaked somewhere near there. And of course, they've lost money. Everybody's lost money in the last couple of weeks, right? But it's so much more money than anyone else has ever made. And then he gave away much of it at the end of his life when he was retired from working. So he's the richest and the most powerful person in the world, probably for many, many years. We also can talk about Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, depending on what part of the country you're from. And he created a business eventually called Carnegie Steel. And this is as important as Standard Oil was. There are many of these people we could talk about. We're just going to talk about a handful. The way he gets his start is he's working in railroads. Again, I would highly encourage you to watch the whole series, The Men Who Built America, if you ever get a chance. It's on History Channel. Periodically. I don't know if it comes up on Netflix or other things, but it's great. And it talks about these guys kind of individually and how they interacted with the other people that they were kind of working against. So Carnegie and Rockefeller and their contemporaries, they operated at the same time. Well, what Carnegie did was he figured out, because he was working on a bridge project, that steel was going to be really important. The problem is steel's handmade largely, so it's very expensive. And to get enough steel to build this bridge, for example, they basically go way over budget and almost go bankrupt, but it works. And in that process, he comes to understand that steel is going to be one industry that's going to be very important to the growth of not just the United States, but any country. So he kind of researches it and looks into it, and he finds this process called the Bessemer process. He buys the rights to it. He builds a steel plant, which he names the Homestead Steel Plant. Of course, it'll be in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, right? The home of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Most of the time, you're going to find that sports teams have some kind of historical basis, right? So the Pittsburgh Steelers are based on the steel industry being in Pittsburgh. And he builds this huge plant. He almost goes bankrupt again. But when they fired it up, and it consists of these huge like burners, and they melt all the material to about 3,000 degrees or something, and then it burns off all the impurities. It chemically changes into steel, and then when they extrude it out and it hardens, it's actual steel. And so he makes a huge fortune on this Carnegie Steel Company. And then you can see here that prices of steel come way down. It's like Rockefeller brought prices of kerosene and other oil products way down. Now Carnegie is going to bring the price of steel way down, and steel will be used to build pretty much everything. There are no skyscrapers in the world until steel becomes cheap enough to build with. So buildings top out at 3-4 stories usually, or they're super expensive. And imagine building railroads out of steel rather than iron. They're going to last 10 times longer. 5 or 6 years for an iron rail, 60 years for a steel one. The boilers are going to be able to hold more pressure and develop more horsepower. So you're going to see that making steel cheap is going to make everything able to be built out of it. And eventually we get automobiles and engines and things like that. But think about factories, the machines in factories now being made out of steel, tools being made out of steel. They're going to have the ability to make better stuff. So that's, again, it's a huge thing that Carnegie does, and he makes a ton of money. Eventually he sells out to a guy named J.P. Morgan. You may know that name from finances. He's a big financier. Not really going to talk about him here, but he's involved in this. He creates a company called U.S. Steel out of this, and he's instrumental in basically building the Panama Canal, arming the United States in World War I and World War II. So without this company, without Rockefeller Oil, not sure how well we're going to do in those wars. Another guy we could talk about is Thomas Edison. Actually, two guys. People always talk about Edison, but don't forget about Tesla. Nikola Tesla was kind of the mad genius, where Thomas Edison was kind of the grinder, right? I don't know, he says, I tried 6,000 times to make a light bulb, right? And Tesla's sort of the one, like a mad scientist. He has these crazy ideas. A lot of them are really good. He doesn't get near the credit that he should. What ends up happening, though, is these two guys create two separate electrical companies. They get investors. Thomas Edison and J.P. Morgan create General Electric, which is still around today. And Nikola Tesla gets together with Westinghouse and creates a company called Westinghouse, which is still around today. And they create electrical products, they create power plants, and there's a whole lot going on here. But of course, the big invention is the light bulb. The light bulb, which allows a lot of things to happen. The light bulb is safer than burning kerosene. Imagine living in an apartment building and having children and them kicking over the lamp. If this were my house would have burned down 25 times. Again, I've got 6 kids, a lot of rough housing, 4 boys, 2 girls, plus me, plus my wife. Things would get crazy sometimes. Sword fights, Nerf fights, all sorts of stuff. And man, we would have burned the house down a million times. So a light bulb is safer. I don't know at that point if it's cheaper or not, but eventually it becomes cheaper and better. And so it's not a surprise to you, to anybody, that the light bulb becomes something that is so common that no one thinks about it anymore. But electricity, of course, goes to far more things than the light bulb. Think about, in a previous lecture, we talked about the buffalo, the hides being used for these machine belts. What happens when we run out of buffalo and we can't make machine belts anymore? Now, rubber hadn't been invented or discovered yet. So if you convert to electricity, it not only gets rid of most of those machine belts, but it also makes your factory more efficient. It's safer. So there's a lot of benefits to it. So you get more work. More work can be done because we can light up the night easier. More work can be done because our factories are more efficient. More play also, more leisure time, right? If we're more efficient, we're going to be better at what we do. We're going to have more time to ourselves. But in addition, it's things like movie theaters. Edison, by the way, invented the movie camera. It's going to be things like just museums, any indoor thing, sports. Sports at this time in the later 1800s are becoming popular, professionalized. Baseball, 1876, I think, is when the National League was formed. 1901, the American League. Sometime later, they merged. But you can only do that when you can see it at night. Basketball is developed in the 1890s. It's an indoor sport primarily, at least for spectators. Again, you need light bulbs for that. Football is an outdoor sport most of the time, until recently. But again, you need lights for that. The problem is, if everyone's working, how do they go to watch a baseball game or a basketball game or a football game unless it's at night? And so by being able to do things at night, we're able to expand the kinds of things we can do. People are able to make more money. And of course, that's always the end goal. So Edison and Tesla, develop these things that are going to be completely life-changing. You think about how difficult things get for you when the power goes out. Tesla should get credit probably for things like radio and alternating current. Edison's kind of the master of direct current. Tesla's the master of alternating current. We actually use both. Alternating current goes from the power plant to your house, and then it gets transformed into direct current from your house to your device or your appliances. And that's the system that we've come to. There are wars between these two companies. Cities have to decide which type of electricity they're going to go to. And so it's kind of creepy and scary, but each side demonstrates how dangerous the other side's electricity is. They are both dangerous. But eventually that's what we settle on. AC is great for long distance transmission. DC is great for local, very short-term transmission. If we had done everything DC, we'd have power plants every other mile. We'd all be dead from pollution probably. So this is a good thing. And so these guys, again, transform the entire world. Again, how much of impact is electricity going to have on Rockefeller's plants and on Carnegie's plants and all this, and just on our daily life? So what we're getting at here is something called synergy. That's the effect of the sum of two or more agents combined is greater than the sum of the individual. You've probably heard it say, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So Rockefeller making better lubricants is going to impact machinery that's made by Carnegie Steel, and it's going to make it more efficient. Then those steel tools in those machines are going to make better products. And those better products will be sold to you and to me. And of course, adding electricity to that is going to make everything more efficient. You also have coolants. So in the previous lecture, we talked about moving cows, right? You had to walk these cows. They had to get loaded on these trains alive. They get shipped to Chicago. They get processed at Chicago, and then the meat shipped back east to where most of the people live. Well, now you can refrigerate things. That's what coolants do. Again, they affect machinery and keeping machinery cool, but they also create refrigeration. And then in the about 1900, air conditioning. I mean, who doesn't love that? But it allows you to have a refrigerator and a freezer. We didn't have that stuff prior to the late 1800s. And so this allows you to, let's say in Killeen, you can raise your cattle. Everything's barbed wired in. You're producing your own special cows with your special brand. And then you can build a meat packing plant here in Killeen. You can hire local people in Killeen, and then you can do the processing and then ship your meat anywhere in the country because you can freeze it. or refrigerate it. So it again has a huge impact on everyone's daily life and on these businesses. So there's a lot of change going on, but all these things are working together to create more. Some of the other synergy pictures that I saw as I was looking for them is 1 + 1 = 3. That's the idea. You get more than what you should get. So there are some other people. There's lots of these guys, and there's some ladies in here too. There's lots of these guys that we could talk about, and just three more to put on your radar. Alexander Graham Bell is the person on the left. He of course invented the telephone and created a company that, if you're like me, you spend a lot of money at every month for your phone service, right? AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph Company, or it might be American Telegraph and Telephone Company. I don't know. Doesn't matter. It's AT&T. They're still around. They've also been monopolized and then broken down into other parts, but he developed that, and that's a system that took off really quick. I mean, before that, we used the telegraph. And imagine trying to communicate with the telegraph. Dots and dashes. It's speaking another language. You'd have to go to a place and tell them the message you want sent and pay for it. And then that message would get sent and relayed, and it wasn't exactly private. And then someone at the other end would either have to hand deliver it or someone would have to go pick it up. It's very inefficient. I mean, it was great for the time, but it was very inefficient. Imagine trying to schedule trains using the telegraph. It's very difficult. And then Alexander Graham Bell invents a machine that you can pick it up and talk into it. And of course, anybody can do that. And so, of course, it takes off. Everybody has a phone. I think he would be shocked, of course, if we had, if he knew that we had this device. This is my little iPhone 7 or whatever. And we had this device where it was a phone and a computer and all these other things. But the beginnings of that is here with Bell. And I think Tesla probably should get some credit there too. But Bell is the one. And of course, phones weren't like they are now. They weren't like they were when I was a kid. You would pick up a line and it would connect you to an operator, one of those ladies with all the wires, right? And you would tell them which address you wanted to talk to, and then it would connect you directly, and then it would ring at that side. And the whole house would be wired to the same line. Then it was, phone numbers, and of course, now you just carry it around with yourself and your number follows you wherever you go. When I was a kid, there were long distance charges and it was a big deal. Now, nobody even cares. Phone numbers and area codes don't seem to matter anymore. So that's one. Cornelius Vanderbilt, basically the first railroad tycoon. He sort of precedes Rockefeller and Carnegie just a little bit. He dies when they're kind of getting started with everything, but Vanderbilt's one of the first people that Rockefeller made a deal with to ship his oil. Then, of course, you got Henry Ford, who does come after these guys. He doesn't fit exactly in the same mold as Rockefeller and Carnegie and Morgan and Vanderbilt and these other guys do. Henry Ford comes later after there's a lot of legislation that's passed, but he's still an example of a new entrepreneur. He's going to get very wealthy. He's going to pioneer a way to make cars not faster in terms of driving faster, although that does happen, but produce them faster and better. So by the 1920s, cars are affordable to most middle-class people. They're months of a salary rather than years and years of a salary, although there are some cars today that still cost that much. So these guys, and again, a lot of others, are in this sort of stage of super wealth. Again, there are people today that fit sort of in this category too. As I mentioned, Bill Gates with Microsoft, all the Apple guys, Jeff Bezos, the Amazon guy, Sam Walton, Walmart. I mean, there's a ton of these. There's hundreds of these. In the old days, it was Wrigley and Hershey and Max Factor making makeup, and a lot of people like that. So there's a lot of these people. We just want to get the idea of what's going on. Now, they got rich. They got super rich. They got stupidly rich. The rest of us got better off, but there's still some real problems. There's still some real challenges in this country, in every country, when you're thinking about labor.